Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling camping and woods horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. My grandfather had a few bizarre wildlife encounters in the forests of Michigan. Since it's starting to get colder in the upper Midwest, I decided that I would share some of my grandfather's stories he told me about his time working as a forester in Michigan's Manistee National Forest. He never got a chance to write any of his experiences down, so I thought I might post them here. For some background, my grandpa started working in the Manistee area in 1949, when he was 28 years old. Before then, he had been drifting around the region, doing odd jobs and logging until he was hired by the Forest Service in the northwest part of Michigan's Lower Peninsula. The work, as I understand, was slow, and most days he and his crew were sent to different parts of the forest to address various tree and land concerns. Grandpa was always an avid outdoorsman, and he enjoyed hunting and fishing just about as much as anyone in the region. Sadly, he died in the December of 1998, when I was still rather young, but I remember whenever we went to visit him and Grandma, he would sit my brother and me down and tell us about his days in the Forest Service. Working outside every day allowed him to witness all sorts of wildlife, like black bear, whitetail, fox, and even bobcat back in those days. He often relived his encounters with bears while he was deep in the forest, telling us that those moments were some of the most memorable of his life, being up close to such beautiful and powerful animals. Usually his tales were exciting, and the enthusiasm with which he told them inspired us to go out to the backyard and look for animals in between the pines. Although there wasn't much wildlife around Grandma and Grandpa's property, they still always kept a close eye on us and never let us wander too far from the house. Finally, a few years before his death, Grandpa deemed my brother and me old enough to be told why. I was about 9, and my brother was about 11 when Grandpa first opened up about the strangest things that had ever happened to him. All our childhoods we had heard him go on and on about the peace that the wilderness brought him, or used to bring him, but this time his tone was completely different. I don't remember all the details, but I asked my brother to help piece together Grandpa's story, and my dad as well. He too had heard of the experiences in question multiple times. It was the mid-50s. He never gave the exact year, and October had rolled in behind cool autumn breezes and the sound of Canada geese flying southward. The first of his strange stories had occurred at night, as he was driving home from a local bar where he and his crew had spent the last few hours after work. It was a windy night, and the pines on either side of the road were blowing ferociously. No moon or stars could be seen through thick cloud cover, so the only illumination of the road ahead came from Grandpa's headlights. By his reckoning, he must have been going close to 50 miles per hour at the very moment when something huge leapt across the road not 20 feet ahead of him. His headlights had shown the animal's silhouette. It was dog-shaped, but massive, almost stretching all the way across the road. It only made one bound to get from one side to the other, and its size alone was enough to unnerve Grandpa. At the time, he had assumed that the animal was just a very large wolf, except timber wolves hadn't been spotted in that region for decades. He considered it a bizarre encounter, but nothing came of it that night, and he was able to return home without anything else strange happening to him. The second of his stories admittedly frightened me enough to avoid going outside at night for years. Even now I'm wary of noises in the dark because of the obvious fear in Grandpa's voice when he told us of his second experience. Some details here were provided by my dad. It occurred in the same month as his first encounter, a few weeks later, on a night that was pretty cold for the season. It maybe hit 40 degrees, but it was a calm night with little wind. Grandpa's house at the time was really small, and it stood in a lot with about 6 other similarly sized and built edifices. None of his neighbors tended to stay up very late, so it surprised him to be awakened by loud noises at about 1 in the morning. They sounded like scratching on sheet metal, with occasional thumps and bumps like an animal was trying to get in. Grandpa apparently got up, fetched a flashlight, put on his boots, and went out into the front room, the walls of which consisted of mosquito screens stretched between wooden framework. Once in the front room, Grandpa could hear the sounds more clearly, and they were coming from the nearest of his neighbors' homes, maybe 50 yards to his right. It was incredibly dark out there, with no street lights to illuminate. The neighbor's house had a porch light on, but Grandpa couldn't make out what was creating the racket through the screen, so he slowly opened the front door and looked out. He described to us in great detail the animals that he saw there, and he always said he would remember them exactly as they were, for fear Brand's memory's the strongest. 3 massive dogs covered in long black hair were up against his neighbor's house, scratching at the siding and making visible claw marks with every swipe. Each beast stood about 7 feet tall, with their front legs stretching for another 2 or 3 feet and easily reaching the roofing and the gutter of the house. Their scratching, however, did not make it seem like they were trying to get into the house, as Grandpa explained. He thought that they were doing that to get whoever was inside out. The next part was actually the hardest to get out of Grandpa. It was strange that he was so eager to tell us everything thus far, despite how he felt about the subject. But he was rather hesitant, as I remember, to divulge the last horrifying details of his encounter. He claims that the animals then noticed that he had emerged from his own house, just across the lawn, for each one turned to look straight at him, just 50 yards away. They had pointed ears like a wolf's, and huge bodies that rivaled large black bears in size. They also supported themselves not with 4 legs, like any other native mammal, but instead they stood on 2 legs each, towering 7 feet above the ground. The sounds that they proceeded to make, Grandpa had said, would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. It was a shame that he could neither produce recordings nor accurately mimic the so unwolf-like screams the animals made, for that detail always fascinated me the most about his story. They didn't sound like foxes, coyotes, or bobcats. Instead, they forced half-scream, half-howls out of their jaws that Grandpa was sure held the teeth of a carnivore. Grandpa never told us exactly what happened next. I guess we assumed that he ran inside, locked the doors, and didn't look outside until morning. He would tell us that 4 of his neighbors, including the elderly couple that lived in the nearest house, didn't stick around very long. He did say that he tried to talk to them about what had happened that night, but they remained evasive and never gave him any straight answers. That turned out to be somewhat ironic, because Grandpa himself kept tight-lipped about many of the details of his stories. He would say that he heard those exact screams on 2 other occasions, both times while he was in the Manistee Forest, and he showed us an old Forest Service report detailing a possible timber wolf sighting in the area, complete with photographs of huge padded paw prints in mud. The thing is, Grandpa never told anyone his stories but his most trusted family, which is unique among Michigan dogman witnesses. After the craze that Steve Cook's legend song stirred in the 80s, it's no wonder that so many stories from the region surfaced. I had heard a few bits and pieces about the so-called monster before Grandpa told his tale, but it wasn't until later in life that I realized his encounters had to have been with the same creature. Whether I believe him that massive wolves walk upright through Michigan forests, well, I'm still not so sure. But as a modern zoological curiosity, the stories of strange beasts from a passionate woodsman who knew his wildlife certainly remain among the most remarkable I've heard, simply because of the genuine emotion with which he related his tales. Legends like these might just be figments of our collective imagination, so all I can do is present what I've heard, and let others judge for themselves what is real and what is pure fiction. Anyway, as the song goes, don't go out at night. Second story. Spiders aren't always the worst thing about camping. Never again can I bring myself to go into the woods. The events that transpired a few weeks ago caused this. Here's my story. I was never a big fan of rural areas, being born and raised into city life. But when my lifelong best friend Cody mentioned a big camping trip that he had been adamantly planning, I couldn't say no. Considering that he was my boss in the office and had given me the week off for the trip, there was no way I was getting out of it. The thoughts of sleeping in a tent surrounded by spiders and centipedes and God knows what else were enough to unnerve me. But after seeing his face light up like a little kid as he detailed his plans, I couldn't bring myself to let him down. He set us up on a 5-day hiking/camping expedition through the woods a few miles outside of town. The woods intersected with our state's reservation for the Native Americans, and being one-quarter Mohawk himself, Cody genuinely wanted to check out some of the scenery that was included around the hiking area. Despite my initial hesitation, it did seem somewhat interesting, and I agreed to go with him on his little trip. Poor judgment on my part. A few weeks go by, and I found myself walking through the woods with Cody with 60 pounds of gear on my back, covered in sweat and mud, and wondering what the fuck I was doing. We had stumbled into the reservation early on the second day of our trip, and it was almost as if the woodland itself had a different aura to it, a purer feeling of some kind that we both noticed. But no matter how clean the nature felt around us, I was still disgusted by all the different insects and thorny plants that I continuously had to flick off from my clothing. After battling a horde of house cat-sized mosquitoes that was assaulting me, I asked Cody, "When are we gonna set up camp?" Not to be a bitch, but my legs are getting a little tired. He consulted his map and pointed over the next hill. "There's an old Mohawk burial ground over that ridge, and I thought it'd be cool to make camp there for the night," said Cody. Afraid to belittle his culture in some way, I reluctantly agreed. When we got to the burial grounds, it just appeared as about a dozen raised stone and grass mounds in a small clearing, nothing special to say the least. We pitched a tent in the tree line around the grounds, so as not to disrespect the dead, Cody said, unpacked, and cooked some food. After eating dinner and discussing our company's upcoming financial merger, Cody grew tired and fell asleep. I powered up my phone and went to make my daily rounds of all the social networking sites, my last attachment to the city life that I had kept during our time in the woods. Under the large trees I was getting no service, but as I walked towards the burial mounds I was able to pick up a signal. As I was waiting for my emails to load up, the water I had with dinner started to catch up to me. Not wanting to urinate an open view of the tent, I ducked around one of the mounds to relieve myself. Finally, my emails loaded, and I saw that absolutely nothing interesting had happened back home in the past 24 hours. Feeling satisfied I hadn't missed anything, I started walking back to the tent to get some rest. When I reached the tent and went to undo the zippered door, I could feel the hair on the back of my neck prick up. That ominous feeling that something was watching me hit, and I was instantly aware of how loud my heartbeat had gotten. I turned my flashlight around slowly, and my beams caught a deer in the brush about 20 feet behind me. He was a pretty large buck, with a large set of antlers, one of which was broken, and an ear that seemed to have been bitten off at some point. When I saw it was just a deer, my heartbeat returned to normal, and relieved, I entered the tent to get some much-needed shut-eye. The next day we trudged onward through the reservation lands. As much as I hated the woods, I had to admit that the foliage was beautiful, and I'm sure any amateur photographer would have been kept busy in this setting. It wasn't until dusk that I noticed something was off. All the bird chirping and forest noises that we had heard all day had completely disappeared. I assumed that the forest went to sleep as soon as the sun started to go down, but Cody seemed a little uneasy about the silence too. Regardless, we had to set up camp, so he went to find firewood while I pitched the tent. Usually, it will take me 2 to 3 tries to get the tent set up correctly. That night was especially difficult because, once again, I had the eerie feeling I was being watched. I wheeled around, and once again see the face of the deer with the broken antler and the damaged ear peering out of the bushes looking at me. Involuntary shudders crept throughout my body, and I got the all-around sense that something wasn't right. When I made movements to try to shoo the deer away, he simply stayed put and stared at me with those beady black eyes. In this case, though, logic overcame my gut instinct, and I realized that the deer posed no serious risk to me, so I shrugged it off and continued setting the tent. When Cody returned with firewood, I told him about the encounter. His lower jaw dropped, and his face instantly put on a look of utter fear. He hurried me into the tent, closed the door, and started telling me a story about the Aquionk, or deer men, that the Mohawks had legends about. They appeared as tall, dark, skinny men yet could take the form of deer and other animals of the forest when need be. He described them as demons of the forest who preyed upon unwanted visitors and invaders to the Mohawk lands. He started explaining legends of how some of the original American colonists were gruesomely murdered after clearing Mohawk forests to make their homes in the New World. At this point, my hands were shaking uncontrollably before Cody had to stop his story mid-sentence from a sudden fit of laughter. He looked at me and said, "Come on, man. I know you're afraid of the woods and all, but forest demons? Don't tell me you believe that shit." I punched his arm and called him an asshole and had no choice but to laugh at myself. Regardless, that night my dreams were plagued by shape-changing deer and wolves and bears who were waiting in the woods to murder me in some brutally violent way. These paranoid thoughts carried over into the next day's hike, where every sound that I heard was something stalking us, waiting for an easy chance to go in for the kill. Unfortunately for me, Cody didn't notice how much his story had thrown me off, and so I still had the task of collecting firewood that night as we set up camp. I took the flashlight and set out before it got too dark. As I was about 10 minutes away from our camp, my flashlight ran across a deer's face sticking out from the foliage about 30 feet ahead of me. Sure enough, he had a broken antler and a ruined ear, so it was the same one I had seen before. His beady, almost dead eyes just stared at me like they had the 2 nights before. Except this time, I noticed that something was really wrong with the whole picture. Then it hit me. The deer's head was almost 8 feet off the ground, and something was defi-fucking-nightly wrong. My hands started trembling as I panned the flashlight down from the deer's face, and between the leaves I saw what looked to be a long, slender black arm with sharp claws pointed directly at me. I dropped the flashlight, turned, and sprinted towards the tent as fast as I'd ever run before in my entire life. Not looking behind me, I reached the camp and pushed Cody inside the tent. In my hysterics, I wasn't able to relay the full story to him, but he caught on to my fear immediately. We grabbed our camping knives, the only weapons we had brought, and sat in the tent that night looking out the windows, vigilant for anything that would try to approach our camp. When dawn finally came, we were both awake still. By that point, he had gotten the full story, and after consulting a map decided that we could make it to a local road and call for a ride back home before nightfall. Leaving all the non-essential items behind, we trekked for the road, called a cab, and got a ride back to the lot where our cars were parked. Cody still didn't entirely believe that what I witnessed was true, but I knew what I had seen. "Go home, get some rest, and we'll meet for drinks tomorrow," he said. "We can talk about it all then." I silently nodded my agreement as he dropped me off at my house and pulled off into the night. Feeling relieved to finally be back in the city, I jogged up the stairs to the door, unlocked it, and walked into the apartment. As I set down my keys and walked to the bedroom for some well-needed rest, I noticed an odd, irony tinge hanging out in the air. The smell was weak, but certainly there. I turned on the bedroom light, and it was just sitting there on my bed staring back at me with its ruined ear and broken antler. The next day, the police told me the deer had been skinned, and some sort of a mask had been made of its face and left in my bedroom. No additional evidence of a break-in was found, and it was never determined how the perpetrators had gotten into my locked apartment. The police investigators tried passing it off as simply another random act of vandalism by some of the meth heads that frequented the area. According to the investigators, the weirdest part was that nothing was taken from the apartment at all. In fact, the only additional clues left behind were the 4 long gash marks that had been cut straight across my bed. Third story. I found a strange camera in the forest. I was on a hike through the forest when I saw it. The camera was sitting on a large boulder as if it had been left for me to find. I approached it hesitantly, looking around to see if there was someone nearby. Maybe someone had set it down and forgotten about it? But there was nobody around. The hiking trail was quiet and abandoned that day. A Tuesday afternoon in January isn't exactly the busy time for these places, after all, but I was bundled up and dressed for the weather, my insulated boots keeping me warm and dry on the cold, snowy day. I stood there for a while, looking to see if someone would come back for it. Part of me thought I should just leave it there, but it was an expensive-looking camera. On the side it said SLR. Not knowing much about cameras, I had still heard of those initials before, and it struck me as being worth quite a bit of money. Not wanting it to get destroyed by the cold weather, I picked it up, thinking maybe I would run across its absent-minded owner further down the path. Surely they would be happy to have it back. But when I picked it up, I saw a tiny yellow sticky note attached to the bottom of the camera. On it were the words, "Finders Keepers," and a smiley face was beneath that. Did that mean whoever it belonged to wanted me to take it? I took off my gloves and realized the camera didn't even feel cold, as if whoever had left it there had just done so recently, in the last few minutes, after taking it out from its case. The lens wasn't fogged up either, as it would have been if it had been left out for hours. Never one to pass up a free gift, especially one that I could sell to make half my rent payment. I took the camera and continued on my hike. It was a decision I would come to regret more than any other choice I'd made in my life. Later, I would lose sleep thinking about what could have been if I just walked away and left it there. What would my life have been like? But of course I'll never know, because I took it and pretty soon I was holding it up to my eye and taking pictures with it. The pictures didn't look right, though. They were too dark, for one thing. There was a grayish-yellow tinge to every shot I took. At first, I was just shooting images of the clouds and the sky, but then I decided to try taking a picture of a nearby patch of trees. One of them in particular looked very unusual, an old oak tree which stood taller and broader than any others in the area. There was a plaque mounted on a stand at the bottom, saying something about its historical significance. When I held up the viewfinder to look at the image I'd taken, it made my blood run cold. My eyes studied the image, trying desperately to make sense of it. The camera was malfunctioning, that was it. It had to be. There was an issue with the processor inside of it, or whatever it was that made it work. Can you tell I'm not a camera expert? And I just needed to take it to a repair shop. I had a friend who knew all about these things, and I decided I would take it to his place first, to see if he could figure it out. The image of the tree was distorted, making it look like a horrifying imitation of itself, stretched out and too thin in places, the branches curling and twisted. Not only that, the colors were dark and malevolent, as if someone had put an Instagram Halloween horror filter on the image. Something about the picture made me very uneasy, and I tried to tell myself it was just a product of the situation. Still, I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing the camera making noises, tiny sounds as if there were little people inside of it, pulling levers and turning gears to make the device work. Drifting off into a nightmare, I pictured them as little devils. And the inside of that camera was hell. Weird, man. I've never seen anything like this, Dave said to me, turning the camera in his hands and looking at it from every angle. You notice there's no company name or logo? I nodded hesitantly. Yeah, except the SLR initials. Maybe you gotta open it up. He pulled out a small screwdriver. After a few more seconds of turning it in his hands, he set it back down on the table. There's no seams, no screws. That's the other weird thing. It's like there's no way to open it up. There isn't even a port for a data cable. So how do you get the pictures off of it? I don't think you can, unless there's some way that I'm not seeing. Man, it's like this thing came from another planet. Maybe it's European? Or it could be from one of those discount online stores. What's it called? Wish.com. You know, the one where you order a TV for $20 and when it shows up it's the size of a dinner plate and non-operational? Either way, I can't fix this thing, and I don't think a camera shop will be of much help either. Great, I muttered. What a waste of time. I thought maybe it was at least worth some money. Fucking rent went up again this year, and I can't remember the last time I saw a race. You should have bought a house when the market was good, my friend. I kept trying to tell you. I tuned out of the rest of his speech about the benefits of home ownership and got ready to leave a little while later, feeling dejected and ripped off, despite the fact that the camera had been free. It felt as if I was losing a little piece of myself to it every second I held on to it. And yet I couldn't bear to throw it away. Hang on, Dave said as I was putting on my boots and coat. Take a picture of me with your weird-ass camera before you go. I want to see what a picture of me turns out to look like. He was laughing and grinning, but I felt horrified by his suggestion. I'm not sure why, but the idea of snapping a photo of him with this creepy camera I'd found in the forest felt wrong. It was a disturbing notion that gave me a sensation of bugs crawling across my skin. Nah, man. I'm tired, I said lamely, trying to make any excuse I could to avoid doing it. I gotta go. What are you talking about, dude? It'll take 2 seconds. He was persistent, joking at first, then beginning to look at me as if there was something wrong with me. At that moment, I didn't want to raise the camera and take a picture of him, but I found myself doing it anyway. Click. What's the worst that could happen? A voice in my mind asked, but I would find out soon enough. The picture I'd taken of my friend was more warped and unnatural looking than the ones I'd taken in the forest. It showed him as a twisted, mutilated version of himself. Dark holes in his head where eyes should have been. Long arms with too many bends and twists in them. And the expression on his face, which should have been a smile, showed up as an angry sneer, jealous and full of hate and rage. Sweet. I look like a fucking demon, he'd said after looking at it. If you find a way to print those, I want a copy of that one. Dave had a final thought as I was leaving his home. He told me there was one other person who might be able to help me with the camera. At first I said I wasn't interested, but then he mentioned that the man might actually buy it from me as well. That piqued my interest, since I was still short a few $100s on rent. I decided I would take one last shot at deciphering the mystery of the strange camera. If this man couldn't help, then so be it. I would throw the damn thing in a dumpster after that. I arrived outside the shop and pulled up to the curb. It was a pawn shop, I realized, but there was a sign out front saying that they specialized in old cameras. More importantly, there was one saying they would pay cash for vintage and modern equipment. The kid at the counter inside looked frazzled, despite the lack of customers. He was pulling his greasy blonde hair hard enough to make it stand up when he let go, giving him a manic, Einsteinian appearance when he looked up to greet me. "Oh, hey," he squeaked, catching a glimpse of himself in a reflection and quickly patting down his unintentional spikes. "Can I help you?" The way he asked the question gave the impression that he would be very happy if I just told him I had the wrong address and walked out the door. The kid looked nervous as hell, and more than that, scared. "Hey, I'm looking for Jim. I was told he might be able to help me with this." I held up the SLR, and the kid's eyes went even wider. "Oh no. No. Get that out of here. Jim's gone. He's gone. He's at St. Daniel's now because of that fucking thing, and if you know what's good for you, you'll get rid of it." He screamed this last part and picked up a pile of papers from the counter, hurling them across the room at me. They scattered everywhere, and I looked through them falling slowly to the floor like leaves, and could see the kid crying. His face was bright red, and he opened his mouth to scream again, but I didn't want to hear the words. I already knew what they were going to be. "Get the fuck out," he yelled as the door swung shut behind me. I ran back to my car as if rabid dogs were chasing me, but I didn't throw out the camera. God help me, I didn't throw out the camera. Instead, I went to St. Daniel's mental health facility on the other side of town. I don't know why I did it. Curiosity, maybe. Maybe something more than that. Maybe the camera has an influence stronger than just what it does with each picture it takes. I'm terrified of how powerful it is. Much stronger than I could have ever imagined at first glance. More powerful than any technology we have on Earth. Sorry, I'm getting distracted. Losing focus. Haha. Anyways, I got to the mental hospital and used what little information I had to weasel my way in there to see Jim, the man from the camera store who seemed to have some ideas in his head about the camera. I didn't want to show it to him right away, afraid of how he might react, so I kept it tucked away as I sat across from him in a lounge, surrounded by other patients playing games and watching television on a fuzzy screen. I lied to get in, making up a story about being his nephew. "Jim," I said, trying to get him to look at me. "I'm a friend of Dave's. I needed to ask you about Dash." I didn't even get halfway through the sentence before he looked up at me sharply and began to speak. "The camera. You found it, didn't you?" I nodded reluctantly. "Oh my God," he said, clutching his shirt and squeezing it like he was wringing out a wet towel. I was starting to believe them. I was really starting to believe them when they said it wasn't real. They told me it didn't exist, and I believed them. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even, hoping he would do the same. He took a few seconds to look around, as if to make sure no one was listening. "You still haven't figured it out yet?" he whispered. "You still don't know?" I shook my head. "No." His eyes went wide as he seemed to consider something. "How many pictures have you taken? Did you shoot any people with it?" A nurse's head jerked up nearby at our conversation, and she began to walk over, looking angry. "Just one person. My friend. I took a picture of him with it," I said, hoping this would reassure the nurse that we were just talking about a camera. But she looked even more pissed off at the mention of photography than firearms. She was marching over and stood looking down at me. Her face was red and angry at first, but then she looked at Jim and her expression softened. "It's okay, Jim. It isn't real. The camera isn't real." She grabbed my arm roughly and told me to get the hell out, using a few other choice words and phrases about how I was disrupting his recovery and reinforcing his delusions. A minute later, there was a security guard standing in front of me saying he would escort me out. I heard Jim screaming as we left, calling out and kicking something over. He was ranting and fighting with the nurses as they tried to restrain him. And then suddenly a voice was speaking through the overhead PA, saying, "Code White. E as in Edward 3. Code White. E as in Edward 3. She repeated it once more, and then there was a loud click. Staff members came rushing past us from every direction, pushing us out of their way as they raced into the locked unit. The guard escorting me looked a bit dejected that he couldn't join in on the fun, and was forced to deal with me instead. "What the hell did you say to him?" he barked at me, after the crowd of staff members had gone by. I didn't answer. "Whatever it was, you really set him off." He walked me right out to the edge of the property, then stood to watch me go. "Don't come back. You hear?" He called after me. "You do. We're calling the cops." After the mental hospital, I didn't know where to go. I tried calling Dave, sitting in a McDonald's parking lot in my car, holding the camera in my free hand and examining it as if looking at it long enough would unlock some mystery I hadn't yet been able to solve. Dave didn't answer, despite me trying him 3 more times. I ended up settling on leaving him a voicemail, telling him to call me back as soon as possible. I was starting to get worried about him. More than anything, I was really wishing I hadn't taken that picture of him, especially after Jim's words at the mental hospital. "Did you shoot any people with it?" he had asked, looking terrified. The way he'd said it, he might as well have been talking about a gun. Something occurred to me, and I sent a text to Dave, telling him where I was going to go and asking if he could meet me there. A few minutes later he responded, saying he would. So he was alive, I thought, breathing a sigh of relief. Still, I felt uneasy. Why hadn't he picked up the phone when I'd called so many times? Then he sent another message, saying, "Make sure you bring the camera." For some reason, it felt like a ransom demand. I would find out why soon enough. When I got out to the trail, I saw Dave's car right away, but he wasn't in it. He sent me another text, saying he got tired of waiting and starting walking, and that he would meet me on the trail. This wasn't too unusual for him, since he was the impatient type and didn't like to wait for anyone. Still, I found the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, some primal instinct telling me to be cautious. I walked out into the forest, following the trail toward the place where I'd found the camera. There was no one on the path, and I was reminded again of the day I'd last been out there. Part of me wondered if anyone had been out this way since I was here last. The answer to that was no, I realized, as I came upon the place where I'd taken the first pictures with the strange camera. If anyone had been out this way, surely they would have reported this to the authorities, or to the press, or to someone. Every single place where I'd taken a picture with the camera, it was transformed. Even the sky off in the distance looked bruised and permanently darkened, that malignant shade spreading visibly wider by the second. I felt a cold sweat running down my brow as I turned and looked at how the forest had changed. The large tree with the plaque at the bottom no longer looked like its majestic old self. Now it was twisted and bent, crooked and dark, just like the photo I'd taken of it. All of the plant life I'd snapped pictures of, everything was distorted and wrong now, and that wrongness was spreading outward, infecting the life around it. "Have you figured it out yet?" a voice asked from behind me. I spun around to see someone who looked like Dave emerging from the forest, coming out from behind a tree and walking toward me. I backed away, seeing the wrongness of his face. The same distorted portrait I had seen when I'd taken a picture of him with the camera the day prior. "I don't think he's smart enough to decipher it. We'll need to spell it out for him," Jim said from behind me, grabbing me as I tried to spin around to fight him off. But this wasn't the same Jim I'd seen at the mental hospital. This man looked like a mutated, deformed version of that person. His scraggly facial hair made it look as if he had not shaved for several days, telling me this could not be the same man. "Who the hell are you people?" I heard myself ask, seeing another man coming out from the trees. "There are millions of dimensions, billions of them," said a version of the kid from the pawn shop, taking the camera from my hand. "All stacked on top of one another. We are from another place, much like yours. But we are better, smarter. Our technology is so far advanced that we have learned to communicate with other worlds, the other versions of our world. We could communicate, to tell them how to build things, to make things for us, but we could not cross over. Not until one of your kind opened the doorway." He began to take more pictures, snapping images of the forest around us. And then he turned the camera and pointed it at me. "Say cheese." I closed my eyes, terrified of what would happen to me if he managed to capture my likeness in an image on that camera. If he did, there would soon be another version of me standing here, looking to take my place, looking to create more portals, more gateways to its dark world. Just as he was pushing down the button to take the picture, I heard a loud bang. A bright flash of light and smoke exploded in front of me, sending me reeling backwards. I stumbled out of the arms of evil Jim, who had been holding me, and fell to the ground, landing in mud and dead leaves. "Swarm, swarm, swarm," a voice shouted, and when I blinked my eyes open momentarily, I saw a SWAT-like team of what I at first assumed were police officers moving in from the nearby trees. A helicopter was hovering above, and several more men and women in body armor were rappelling down on ropes, landing all around us. I heard the sounds of a scuffle, people being thrown against trees and handcuffed, and several weapons being discharged. Still mostly blind from the flashbang, I wasn't really able to witness any of it. When I came to my senses, there was a man standing over me, holding his hand out to help me up. I shook my head, telling him I needed a minute. I was still dizzy from everything that had happened. "Pack it up, ladies and gentlemen," he said with an air of authority. "We've got what we came for." Nearby, someone was placing the camera in a black, heavy-duty-looking case. He snapped it shut and put it inside another, larger case with a bigger lock. "Begin destratification procedures," he announced. "Who are you guys?" I asked, looking around and seeing men and women in reflective metallic suits carrying long, futuristic-looking guns. They began pointing them at the sky and at the areas of the forest where the malignant darkness was spreading. After several seconds, the darkness stopped growing and actually started retreating. "We're the good guys," the man standing over me said. "I'm sorry about your friend." We didn't get there in time to save him. Unfortunately, these folks don't like leaving credible witnesses. Dave, I asked, feeling like the world was suddenly spinning twice as fast as before. He's dead? I'm afraid so. He tried to contact you, against their wishes, and they killed him. He was trying to warn you. I shook my head. It was all so crazy. How could I ever explain this to anyone? Who would ever believe it? Please sign this form indicating you will never tell anyone about the events which happened to you recently involving this object, the man said, holding out a form for me to sign. What if I don't want to? I asked, feeling uncooperative. Well, then you won't get this check for $10,000 with your name on it. A finder's fee for the discovery of this item. Standard payment amount. But only for those willing to sign the NDA. I sighed, feeling like I might as well get something out of all of this madness. The camera was gone, anyway, and that was a good thing. I was glad to have it out of my life. Sure, I said, taking the clipboard and pen. 10 grand will pay my rent for a year. I'm sure Dave would have wanted it this way, except for the part about him being dead. The man scrunched up his face in a frown and examined my signature, then handed me a check. I examined the payer line, trying to figure out who the hell these people were. All it said was the organization. And when I looked up, they were gone. Fourth story. Camping trip near Tuba City, Arizona. Hello, my name is Matthew. Today, I want to share a story of something that happened to me when I was in high school. About my sophomore year of high school, my best friend and her dad invited me to go on a camping trip in Arizona, north of Tuba to be specific. Her dad owned a cabin several miles off the highway that was close to some nice camping and fishing spots and wanted to show us a good time. My best friend Kelly and I had been friends since the 5th grade and was someone I regarded as a sister, especially because our parents were close friends. Her dad and my dad were best friends in high school and both married mutual friends, so there was a sense of family growing up with Kelly. This year for their camping trip, it was just going to be Kelly, her dad Ryan, and myself. We left home for the 6-hour drive and made it to the cabin just before sundown. Because of the approaching darkness, all we could do that day was make a fire and cook some dinner so we could get to bed early for the next day's hike. That night, Ryan told us all the trails he had planned for us to backpack and camp at. Kelly and her dad were fairly experienced campers and would go on 2-week camping trips every summer. They had camped everywhere from the Rockies to Appalachia. Every year they would go alone, but this year is the first time they invited someone else to go with them. My dad wanted Ryan to take me because he thought I would do me some good. You see, about a year ago, I lost a close friend of mine in a hit and run. I sunk into a deep depression and basically disconnected from everyone in my life. My parents tried everything to help me, but still I suffered. Dad thought that if I got away and went on this camping trip, it would help clear my mind. I was happy to spend time with Kelly because she'd always been there for me. Kelly and I would often filter into different crowds and sometimes go weeks or months without really talking, but no matter how long we spent apart, we could always pick up where we left off. Her dad, Ryan, was almost like an uncle to me. He'd be the one to show me a movie my parents didn't approve of or let me sip a beer every once in a while. He was someone I could truly go to if I ever needed help, so I knew that he genuinely wanted to help me on this camping trip. We finished dinner and talked until the fire died down to the glowing embers of what was left of it. With the light of the fire gone, it was the first time I had ever looked up and seen the stars without the light of the city obscuring them. It was also the first time I saw how dark the forest can get. Ryan said it was time for bed and handed us each a flashlight. We followed him into the cabin where we would stay the night. The cabin was very rustic as it had no running water or electricity. Ryan shut the door of the cabin and hung a battery-powered lantern on the ceiling and told us our plan for the next day. We were going to hike about 8 miles to a campsite that he picked out for us and said that we needed to go to bed because we'd have to leave as soon as dawn broke. The next morning, we woke up and Ryan and Kelly showed me how to pack my backpack, and we headed off up the trail. After hiking up the trail for 4 hours, we finally reached the campsite. It was a beautiful lake surrounded by peaks on all sides. There was a flat area where we could set up the tent and make camp. We spent that whole day fishing and exploring the area around the campsite. It really was a therapeutic experience for me. My mind felt free of thoughts of the accident, and it felt like my depression was back home, and I could be myself again. Ryan taught me how to fish, and we even caught a few that we were able to cook that night. It was even warm enough that we could sleep outside the tent under the stars. It was one of the best days I'd had in over a year, and it was the last night of peace that I would have for a long time to come. The next day, we packed up and were going to move on to the next campsite. But first, we had to return the cabin as the trail to the next campsite crossed paths with the cabin. Ryan let us sleep in because the return trip was downhill and wouldn't take as long. When we got about halfway down, we encountered some berry bushes close to the trail that Kelly spotted and said were edible, so we spent a few minutes picking the berries. They were surprisingly sweet for being a wild berry, but still had a somewhat bitter aftertaste. After we spent a couple minutes picking berries, Ryan sat down his backpack and said he needed to take a leak. So he went only about 10 steps away and went behind a tree to relieve himself. As soon as he left our line of sight, something changed in the forest. Everything went still. No birds chirping, no wind. It was dead silent. Now you'd think that in a silent forest you'd be able to hear the sound of a man's urine hitting the side of a tree from only a few feet away, but there was no sound to be heard. An eerie, almost primal sense passed over me. I knew there was something wrong. After a few minutes, Kelly called out for her dad, but there was not reply. We quickly wrapped around the tree and Ryan was gone. Not only was the tree completely dry, but there were no footprints leading away from the tree and no sign that Ryan had been standing there in the first place. At that point, I started to panic internally, and I started to yell Ryan's name to the forest, and Kelly started calling out Dad as loud as she could. I looked at Kelly and asked her, "What the fuck just happened?" At this point, forest returned to normal, but still Ryan was nowhere to be found. I picked up his backpack and left mine behind as he had more useful supplies in his. We spent the next several minutes looking around the area where he disappeared, but still could find no trace of him. I look at Kelly and ask her, "What do we do?" And she says, "We have to get search and rescue up here as soon as possible." I said, "But how? We don't have our cell phones, and even if we did, there's no signal out here." Kelly stopped to think for a moment, then she spoke with an idea. "Dad's truck has a radio in it that we can use to call for help. If we go back to the cabin, we can use the truck radio to call for help." After deciding it was best to try and get search and rescue, we start heading down the mountain as quickly as we can. But almost as if nature itself were trying to prevent us from getting help, the sky starts pouring rain on us. Thunder and lightning roll in as well as some hail. We step off the trail for a moment and use the tarp for the tent as a makeshift umbrella until the rain stops. It rained for a good 45 minutes, and as quickly as the rain came, the clouds were broken by sunlight. We took the tarp off of us, and just ahead of us there was a small clearing in the forest that was illuminated by beams of light shining between the clouds. We stand up and see a herd of deer come out of the other side of the clearing. I looked over to Kelly to see a small smile grow on her face. After watching the deer for a few minutes, I noticed that Kelly's expression had gone pure white. She looked at me and said, "Matthew, what the fuck is wrong with those deer?" I took a second look and noticed that there was something off about the deer. I haven't spent as much time outdoors as Kelly has, but I have seen my fair share of deer living in Colorado. Something about these deer just moved different than the deer I've seen before. The way I can describe it is as if their movements lacked the grace that deer typically have in their steps. These deer's movements were stiff and almost mechanical. Also, their eyes had colored iris and white sclera, not like human eyes, but still something I've never seen in a deer before. Then Kelly said something to this day I will never forget. She said it without fear in her voice, but still the tone told me she was uneasy. Kelly looked at me and said, "The feet, Matthew." I looked at the feet of one of the deer, and I saw that these deer lacked the cloven hooves that deer and elk have, but instead had what looked like canine feet. I realized in that moment that whatever these creatures were, they weren't deer. Almost as suddenly as I realized this, one of the deer looks up and looks me dead in the eyes. My fight or flight response was instantly triggered, and I grabbed Kelly's hand and pulled her with me, and we ran as fast as we could away from the clearing until we got to a safe distance from the deer. I look at Kelly and say, terrified and out breath, "Those weren't deer, Kelly. I don't know what those were, but those weren't deer." Kelly looks back at me and says nothing for a minute. My whole life, Kelly had been my fearless friend. Her mother died giving birth to her, and her dad raised her alone. Ryan had taught his daughter to be strong and to never back down from a challenge. But at this moment, for the first time, I saw true fear in Kelly's eyes. She finally opens her mouth and says, "We need to leave." She starts down the trail faster than I can respond. I follow her, and I keep going on about the deer, but she wouldn't have it. We finally reached the cabin, and luckily Ryan left the keys to the truck on his bed. We called the Forest Service, and they picked us and take us to their local headquarters. We tell the ranger what happened, and he says that Ryan must have gotten lost. We both look at him, and Kelly says, "How could he get lost walking 10 steps to a tree?" The ranger brushed it off as the forest playing tricks on us and gives some lecture on how easy it is to get lost in the forest. I tried to mention what happened with the deer, but Kelly kept changing the subject every time I tried to mention it, so eventually I gave up. The ranger launches a search for Ryan that lasted 2 weeks. My dad drove up to and put us up in a hotel for the duration of the search and even volunteered to help the search. None of their efforts mattered, though, because after the 2-week search, the Forest Service basically said there was no hope of finding him. The news was obviously devastating to everyone, as Ryan meant so much to all of us. He was my dad's best friend and Kelly's only parent. After we got back home, Kelly stayed with us for a few weeks until her grandparents eventually moved down to take care of Kelly. A few months later, Kelly's grandparents get a call saying that they found remains on a trail that matched Ryan. This crushed us even more to find out that what we already suspected was indeed true. Ryan was dead. As terrible as the news was, it was also relieving to finally know the truth. Something that bothers me to this day about the discovery of his body is that his remains were found on a trail several miles away from the one he disappeared on. The Forest Service to this day still has not given a good answer to why Ryan's body was found so far away, and still has only given vague answers to the circumstances leading to the recovery. It's been over 10 years since this happened, and after all of this, Kelly and I are celebrating a year of being married. Despite being so close to her, this is still a topic that we rarely discuss, and after 10 years, she still refuses to speak about the deer. I don't know what the hell happened to Ryan, but so far, no explanation has been able to satisfy me. I spoke to my dad a few years ago about the search he volunteered on. I waited so long because of how close he was to Ryan, and I didn't want to pour salt in an already open wound. He said that search and rescue was really cagey about this one. Like you could tell that this was something that they were trying to brush under the rug. What perplexed my dad the most was that the rescue dogs couldn't pick up a scent, something that the handler said he'd never seen them do before. How did Ryan's body end up on a different trail? Why was search and rescue so cagey about this case? What the hell were those deer, and why won't my wife speak about it? I still have no answers to give to these questions. Maybe someday the answers will be revealed to me, but for now I'm going to be there for my wife, Kelly, and if she ever is ready to talk about that day, I may post an update. Also, will post updates with any new info I find. Fifth story. The last time I went camping. I went camping a few years ago while I was in high school, and some weird shit happened. Up until now, I've been too terrified to even try Googling what could have been going on. So here I am, hoping the informative people on this sub could give me some answers. It was my senior year of high school in an incredibly small southern town. I was graduating early, so it was a huge deal for my family and myself. My mom, sister, and I lived with my grandparents, and we were all really close. The grandparents, nervous about me graduating at a young age, were especially sappy about the whole thing. My grandpa, being the sentimental, sweet guy that he was, decided to take me camping for a couple days as a last hurrah before I left town. I agreed to the adventure without a second thought. I had been camping many times before and figured one last weekend in the woods would be a great memory to take with me on my life journey. After the first, and what ended up being the only night, I wished I had said no and gone to one of the crazy parties happening that Friday. Grandpa and I packed our stuff early in the morning and set out for the most popular place to camp near where we lived. Despite being one of the best and only campsites, as it wasn't attached to a trailer park, it never felt crowded. The spots were spread out extremely well, each with a trail leading to the individual site from the main road where you could park your vehicles. The one we picked out overlooked a small cliff above the river that ran through the park. When I say small, I mean anywhere from 8 to 12 feet. Across the river, a span of about 30 feet, there was a bank that led to dense woods. At first, I thought it was a lovely view. The site itself was average. There was a tent pad about 15 feet from the cliff. Across it was a fire pit, and overlooking the river was a picnic table that had a pole with a hook next to it that a lantern could be hung from. Wanting to save the evening for fishing and maybe a swim, the Gramps and I set our tent up, fixed the sleeping bags, and had a light lunch. The afternoon bled into night at what I thought was a quicker than average pace. We didn't catch any fish big enough to be worth keeping, and our swim in a more well-known part of the river was cut short by a group of rowdy teenagers. So at around 1800 we got back to our home for the weekend and passed the time with an interesting game of seeing who could throw pebbles the farthest across the river. I bested my competitive grandpa, and he chalked it up to having a bad back. At 19:30, we started up the fire and roasted hot dogs, following them up with some s'mores. A typical night camping. For the moment, Grandpa killed the fire around 2100, feeling we should call it a night and head out on some trails in the morning while it was still cool. It was a clear night, and the stars were absolutely beautiful, so we didn't put a tarp over the tent, figuring if it did end up raining, it would at least make a memorable story. Standing up, I could see outside and all around the tent. Laying down, I could only see the sky and the treetops. I remember this making me feel a little uneasy, and then extremely uneasy. I woke up at some point in the middle of the night to my grandpa snoring. Groggy, I checked my phone. It was 0323. Great. I recall thinking to myself, I can get about 2.5 more hours of sleep before sunrise. A little more awake now, I started to notice something off about my grandpa's snoring. It was deeper than typical and guttural. For a split second, I thought something could be wrong with him, so I looked over, with intent to get up and wake him, only to see by the faint moonlight that he was breathing normally. I could hear it now, his actual breath. Turns out, he was snoring, but it was soft, and I had to focus extra hard to make it out, mixed in with what I now realized was a recurring growl coming from somewhere outside the tent. Upon this realization, I was filled with curiosity. Being from a small town, and used to being in the wilderness, surrounded by varying animal noises, I wasn't immediately fearful. That would come, though. I tried to go back to sleep. I thought it would be easy, but after a couple of minutes, I started to feel like keeping my eyes closed was dangerous. Like when you're washing your face in the shower and you risk getting soap in your eyes because it feels like someone is there with you. This odd instinct was overpowering, so I opened my eyes. My heart rate started increasing when this fight or flight feeling only got worse now that I could see something other than my eyelids. You're being ridiculous. I tried to reason with myself, all the while becoming more and more aware of this odd growling. It didn't sound like any animal I would be weary of in this area. It felt foreign and disturbing. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I stood up and looked outside the tent. Our site was untouched and peaceful, looking under the moon and stars. Then I made the mistake of looking across the river. It reflected the sky, and before I looked to observe the bank, I almost wanted to go sit on the small cliff and enjoy the night. Almost. Since the growling wasn't coming from our side of the river, I started scouring the bank with my eyes, from as left as I could see, making my way right, trying not to miss anything. The fateful moment came when I looked directly across from me. I saw a tall creature. It was dark. Not as an outside was dark, but this thing was dark. It seemed like it sort of blended in with the woods behind it, but I could just make it out. I tried not to yelp, but that being filled me with a terror that I think would be impossible to feel again, and I could barely take my eyes off of it. But I did, and I hate myself for that. I sunk back onto my sleeping bag, wished that I was dreaming, and shut my eyes really tight. Then I heard a splash, and not 2 seconds later could I hear the growling get louder, accompanied by a scraping noise from the side of the cliff. It had also started to smell like rotting flesh. Sickeningly sweet, but also musty, a drastic change from fresh air and being surrounded by trees. Whatever that thing was, it had moved across the river impossibly fast. The scraping stopped with one last final kick? Push? I wasn't sure, but that thing was now on our side of the river, standing 15 feet from the tent. I wanted to throw up. Then I heard footsteps, heavy, and I did something worse. My sleeping bag got warm and my shorts were now sticking to my wet legs. I began to cry as this creature moved closer and closer to where my grandpa and I were, in a tent, unsafe. Things started hitting the tent. Pebbles. It was taunting me. The smell was getting worse, and that horrible growl was making my soul shudder. I wanted to wake up my grandpa, but I was frozen, laying on top of my sleeping bag, staring straight up, waiting to see this thing's horrible face. Then I saw it, and it wasn't looking at me yet. I saw massive shoulders, but I couldn't tell if it was covered in fur or skin or scales. It was just like it was when I saw it across the river, blending into the background. It was circling the tent, dragging its hand or paw or whatever over the mesh. I started gagging from the smell, and then it saw me. It had huge, but colorless, eyes, even for its incredible size. I'm thinking around 7 feet tall. I let out a scream and my grandpa wakes up. This thing grunts and I hear another splash. Grandpa looks at me and I just tell him I had a nightmare, knowing he wouldn't believe the experience I just had. I tell him I want to go home right now, so we leave. I haven't gone camping since then. I haven't even wanted to figure out what this creature was, but some friends invited me to go camp with them, which I denied. But I think I'm ready to know what this was. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.